Hello? You hear us?
Oh, now we're starting to. Oh no, that's just us.
Dawn's there. Woohoo!
I'm here.
All right, welcome home, Dawn.
Yeah, it was, I was gone for a very, very long time.
Ooh, that's nice and loud.
Hang on, I gotta get my computer setup is all goofy, so bear with me as I try and get this all set up. There we go. Okay, that's looking a little better on my end. We got a good room today.
Hello, Dawn.
Hi there, how you doing? Hi, Kathleen.
Right. I'm gonna sit here and does good things and I don't know what they are.
Here, I can take those.
Put in my
collection. Thank you. I think so.
No, my honeycomb earrings. Here. I like my phone. Yes. Where did John go? How was the Yeah, I was in time today to. I just had to touch every time. Yeah. Oh, really? Well, I don't know, what would you, if it's storming? Restart in.
Kit or Brian, I can hardly hear anything in the room. I'm wondering if the microphone is not set up, or if the owl, if it's not connected to the correct microphone, or its volume's not up. We have all kinds of options.
All needs to go on the box. On what, sitting on that box. Box there.
Oh, really? It goes up
Yeah.
higher?
Tracy, can you hear the room, or is it just super, super quiet?
Yeah, it's quiet. We're not talking very loudly until you even show
Yeah,
up
but
on-
I normally I can hear the chatter. This, I can barely even hear that there's talking going on.
Okay, Brian's not here today, so I'm open to your feedback.
If you go to, I think what happens usually is if you go to the lower left corner of the screen, there's a microphone and it has audio settings on the very bottom. When you click on the little arrow next to microphone, a drop down at the very bottom shows audio settings. Let me
Thank
know when
you.
you're there.
We're there.
No, I'm on game bar settings and snipping tool. I don't think I'm on the right place. But I normally, that's the.
On the Zoom screen at the very bottom, if you're looking at Zoom, the lower left corner is the little microphone icon.
The microphone is right here and it didn't help me.
More than a foot of snow. And one year we had just a little bit of frost. So it really depends on the year and how much weather we get. Importantly for the winter hive configuration, whatever insulation and moisture boards you choose to use, I think it's important to use upper entrance. The bottom tends to get a carpet of dead bees on it, and the bees don't tend to go down and out, but they like to fly out through the top to go to the bathroom. So they will take cleansing flights even when there's snow on the ground. And it's easier for them to do those cleansing flights if you've got an upper entrance. Those candy boards or fondant or dry sugar, like I have, I think are important emergency food. And then you can just tip that shim open in the winter once a month and take a peek inside and just make sure they haven't run out yet. And then some people use follower boards. Those are basically plywood boards instead of frames on the outside. And Kathy likes to use those because it helps to kind of create a chimney effect and draw the moisture to the outside of the boxes instead of on the top, because cold bees live through the winter. Wet, cold bees definitely don't, they die. So you want to keep that water from raining back down on them, whatever means you have. And then now too is the time to reduce the space that they have, either down to 1 deep or maybe 2 if you've got a big population of bees, or the equivalent if you're running all mediums, 2 to 3 mediums. It's better to pack them into a smaller space than to have a lot of extra space right now. And then the entrance reducer configuration, once all the wasps died, you take your robbing screens off, then you notice that this one is the bigger entrance, but you would want to switch to the smaller entrance and have it shaped like a U with the opening facing up, so that if there is a carpet full of dead bees on the bottom, that the bees can crawl across the dead ones and still be able to get out. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and see if anybody has any questions. Maybe. Maybe. Stop.
So treatment question. I have 3 hives, gave them all 3 double padiformic mid-September because 2 of them had caught a mite bomb. The third one, which was the one that was doing well, has now picked up said mite bomb after treatment. I'm aggressively doing OAV right now. Would you recommend trying to do a second round of formic on them or just continue OAV?
So it's getting kind of late for formic with the temperatures. So formic usually works a little bit better at higher temperatures. Same with Apogard. You want to have the warmer temperatures. So right now, Formic's not a great option either, because if you still have capped brood, for OAV is not very effective because the mites are under the wax cappings.
Mhm.
So right now you're kind of in the middle. I mean, you can try the Formic pad, but that, your example is a great reason why you want to not only test for mites, but then after your treatment to test again to see where you're at, to see whether it was effective or not.
Well, and I think what I agree with you that it's too late for Formic, and also because the bees are kind of about almost 3/4 of the way through making their winter bees right now, and the Formic is a lot harder on the brood, and any brood that you kill off is your winter bees, so you really want to maintain that brood level. Formic, I do use Formic in the late fall, but if there's a lot of brood present, I just do it 3 times in a row, every 4th day. And what that does is as the brood emerges, and if it has mites, it gets the mites right then when they emerge. So you would have a continuous acidified environment for those 12 days when that capped brood is emerging. So it's more work, but
Yeah, you mean OAV, right? You said Formic.
Yeah, she said.
I'm
Formic.
sorry,
Kind
OAV.
of-
Yeah, I get the words wrong sometimes. I did mean OAV.
Yeah, that's my plan right now. Is I was doing every 5th day and continue until mite's dead.
And the advice is every 4th day. So
Okay.
you're covering a 12-day period. Every 4th day, 3 times every 4th day will get you 12 days. And that's how long the brood is capped.
So hopefully next week I should start seeing numbers drop. Great.
Although right now is also what Jeff and I always joke about, the third honey flow. So as other folks' bees are crashing, if you have strong colonies right now, they're going and robbing those out. So you get also a big influx in honey stores right now if you have a strong colony. And unfortunately, you always they tend to bring mites back too. So
Yeah, I know
I tend to
exactly where the
use-
mites are coming from.
yeah, I tend to use Apigard in the fall, but it's even getting cool for that.
I've got a question.
Go ahead.
So I've got 3 hives. 2 of them are doing very, very well. The last hive, it's got lots and lots of honey, lots of nectar, no brood. I tried requeening it 10 days ago and looked again tonight, and I don't see any brood or any eggs. What should I do?
So did you requeen with a mated queen?
Yes.
And have you checked to see if there's were they making a queen cell at the time when you put the new?
No.
So my last question in my 20 question quest is what was the mite level in that colony?
I unfortunately did not check. So
I would assume that it's pretty high. And so if you combine that with your other 2 colonies, you're going to migrate those mites over. And so I might just go ahead, if it was mine, just let those die and not and pull the honey so that your other bees don't go and bring the mites home. And then you can add the honey to the other colonies if you want.
all right, there's still lots and lots of bees there. And should I kill
Well,
them?
in this case, you could
Yeah.
probably treat with Formic because you're not worried
Yeah.
about the brood because you'd be combining them. So you could hit them with a double pad of Formic, and then in 10 days, combine them.
You could also use oxalic acid drip since there's no, or
That's-
vapor, either
be
of those
good.
3 choices.
Yeah,
So-
the dribble's good.
So I know that the new strips of oxalic acid are not licensed in Washington, right?
Yeah, so those are pretty good at keeping the mite level low, but they're not, they don't work very well as a treatment. So that's why Dawn and I were recommending either oxalic acid dribble oxalic acid vapor or formic acid, formic pro pads.
Okay.
And if you haven't treated your other colonies, you might consider doing that at the same time.
That sounds like I need
The other
to
thing to
check.
consider, the other thing to consider if you are combining hives with high mite loads is they're going to have a high viral load too. And bees that are exposed to mites get sick. They get really sick in ways that we can't see. There's, I don't know, there's 18, I think it's up to 24 known viruses now. And the challenge that we're having with Varroa and viruses is that, as we learned during COVID, when you get a whole bunch of virus going around in the same spot or even in the same animal, it mutates. And the bee viruses are mutating and they're actually getting stronger because those viral levels are so high because of the mites. And so you may be putting your strong colony at risk by combining them. So like Tracy said,
Just
maybe
just pull the honey. I mean, or
yeah, or just you could wait until spring. They'll expire on their own. There's really nothing you need to do. And if they have survived, it takes about 6 weeks for a viral load to come back down. You need a couple generations of healthy bees before you've got a good strong colony again. And so about, I don't know, 4 to 6 weeks before they're healthy. That's too late for this year. But if they pull through and they're still there and kicking in the spring, then it's probably safe to combine them because they would have cleared the viral load and the mite load would be eliminated because you would have treated.
I forgot to ask, did you see the queen?
no, I saw nothing. I mean, I saw lots and lots of bees, but could not find the queen.
Probably.
It's also possible this time of year that if you've got an extremely winter oriented queen, they sometimes just stop laying. If the temperature, now the weather's been warm enough, I don't think that's super likely right now, but there are times when the weather drops and I do a last minute check on my hive and I'm just going into winter with a wing and a prayer because I didn't see any brood.
So what I'm sort of hearing you say is pull the honey, try to leave enough honey for them to survive the winter, and then just recheck in the spring.
I would leave all the honey. I mean, you wouldn't even need to bother them. Just leave them the way they are. And then if yeah, you wouldn't need to do anything.
And if they're going to die, they're going to die before November anyway. More than likely.
Thank you.
And don't feel bad. Don't feel bad. We give this advice because we've been there. I mean, we've all had this happen. And
Well, I should have checked for mites.
yeah, don't worry. The worst gut punches for beekeepers always come in the spring. I mean, to be a beekeeper, you got to be able to hang on during these highs and lows. And when the blackberries are blooming and everything's flowing, the bees are happy. You just feel like, oh, I got this. I'm rocking it, And then you lose a colony or something, or they get really cranky. And August is a really hard time to keep bees. So there's the highs and lows, and just know that this is a low spot. We're all there. It was a really, really hard year for all of us. In fact, it was a hard year globally, believe it or not. I've talked to people in Italy and Slovenia who are literally going out of business because their bees didn't bring in any honey.
Wow.
So it was a tough year. So if you guys still have bees alive, if you're a beginner and you have bees alive right now, you are doing awesome.
And 2 out of 3 is not bad.
Yeah, it's actually really good.
Actually.
I have a question. So I inspected my Landstroth hive about a week ago. And I saw brood. I never see the queen. I don't really spend a whole lot of time harassing them looking for her. But I've been feeding them sugar syrup and they've been taking it. And of the 3 boxes, there's a lot of capped and uncapped either syrup or honey. So what I was thinking, I was going to go in and try to, try to consolidate, maybe even eliminate a box, but there's so much resources in there, I just left it alone. Should I be taking some full combs out, to reduce down to, let's say, 2 boxes, or just?
That depends. Do you have other colonies that need it?
No, I have a top bar hive, so
Oh, then
Yeah.
I just leave it.
just leave it. Okay. And then maybe as they empty combs, remove them. And I do have follower boards, just move them in closer.
Well, they'll move up. Yeah, and
Or the-
over the
It's,
winter,
it's top bar. So Jeff,
No,
will
no.
chime in.
his other one's top bar.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So you were saying about the Langstroth hive?
So I'd move all the brood down to the bottom box if possible, the next warm day,
Okay.
with some pollen and nectar and then honey on the outside. And
Okay.
then if there's enough brood to, have a little bit more in the second box, then
Okay.
put that in the middle and leave the honey on the outside, and then leave the top box all honey and a little bit of pollen, so that when they move up over the winter, they've got a little bit of pollen in February and March when they're starting to brood up.
Okay.
But just go ahead and make that honey cap on the top.
Okay. So try to concentrate brood in the bottom box, but
Yep.
make sure they have some honey on the outside.
And pollen too, for right
And
now, to
pollen.
feeding up that brood.
Okay. There hasn't been a whole lot of pollen. I've been giving them pollen patties. So
Yeah, you
Okay.
can stop doing that, at the end of this month.
the pollen patties?
Yeah, because unless you use winter, you want to switch to winter patties, because
Yeah, I have.
trying to raise a lot of brood in the winter.
Right. Yeah, I've been using winter patties.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, any last call for questions, and we'll have time later for questions also if you think of one that you didn't think of before. So let's jump into the business part of the meeting. We are right on time, which is awesome. So welcome to fall. Today is actually the last day that's going to be over 70 degrees for like 8 or 9 months. Until next May or June. Somebody just pointed that out to me today. I was like, oh man. So we're still going to get some good weather. So far we're coasting into a nice fall, but I think our 70-degree tomato ripening days are pretty much done.
That's why there was all the boats out on the water today.
Yeah, like kind of a last hooray.
Last hurrah.
Yeah. And the bees are well into getting ready for winter. So I just want to we don't have a whole lot to talk about tonight. I just want to talk a little bit about what's been going on in the club. We held a lot of apiary days this year, and we had a lot of board members come and help lead those. Jeff led some, Kit led some. I think Tracy, you showed up and led one, right? And of course, Kathleen is there every single time as our apiary manager. So they were a lot of fun, and people always go away feeling so good and having had such a good time. So if you didn't make it to any this year, do come next year. Having a mentor right there, hands-on, learning how to handle frames is just absolutely invaluable. And we're a captive audience. You can ask us questions the entire 2 hours. And we are there for you. It's like having somebody there for you for 2 hours. So do come to the apiary if you can. And we'll be holding apiary days next year. We had some great club events this year, thanks to Kit. They're all wrapped up for the year, but we had the West Seattle Festival, and then we had the Chomp Festival. So those were a lot of fun. And then we also had our club picnic in July, which was really, really good. And then we've got a few things coming up. We've got at the November meeting, that's our business meeting, and that's when we do our elections. So if you want to come and see how elections are done and maybe see if there's space on the board, go ahead and come to the meeting. In December, in lieu of a meeting, we have our holiday potluck, and it's usually right there at the room you guys are in at the Arboretum. And that's really nice. People bring really good food and sometimes honey themed food, and it's just so pleasant. So come in December, we'll post that in the newsletter when the potluck is. And then in January is when that's really when we start our B year again, and we start having our meetings with the vendors.
Dawn, can you hear us?
Lower left.
Dawn,
sorry?
can you hear us?
I
Yes,
can
you
hear
can
you,
hear-
yes.
Kit wanted to correct something about the potluck.
Okay,
The public happens with the election. There's nothing in December.
oh, there's nothing in December. Oh, good, okay, thank you, thank you. So no meeting in December, but we've got elections and potluck. I will change that in my notes. In November, so that's good. And everybody has so many, well, I used to, I don't anymore, but some people have a whole lot of Christmas parties to go to. So it makes it a little bit harder to get any attendance in January. So that works well. So we've got a great speaker lined up for October. We've got the business meeting with potluck and elections in November. We take December off. Then we start our B year anew with our vendors who you can purchase bees from. And that's when we start getting ready for spring. So that's kind of what's coming up during the next year. So before we move into the time for the speaker, Kit or Brian, Jeff, Magali, anything else to add for the business, for the good of the club?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My live, just trying to recall how 23 worked for the business meeting. I recall we did not have a Zoom. Everything was in person for the election. And,
yeah, I think we'll talk about that at the board because it's hard to vote. It's hard to vote confidentially by Zoom.
Right. I would imagine we'd do it the same way, and it'd be good to announce it to them, I guess, just to have people tune in to figure out what we figure out. So they know whether they have to come to the party. It's a party, you know, it's a potluck, so come on down, but.
And I'm thinking maybe we did hold it by Zoom. Now remember, I'm in 3 clubs and I know we have had Zoom people able to vote, and that would be, oh no, Magali, there she is. I was just gonna, Magali would remember because she's our technology wizard.
We did both. We had a Zoom voting option, which actually was a Google form. So we had an option online and we had an option in person, and I believe we held it hybrid last time.
Awesome, Magali, thank you.
Yep, and we'll talk about mechanics of how to do all that at the board meeting, because we forget. I mean, it's like once a year and then we have to reinvent it every time.
Dawn, I do have just one other question, I guess, about the potluck.
Mm-hmm.
My memory, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but just in case this, the word potluck scares anyone. My memory is that last year we actually weren't able to do and everyone brings their own food potluck, and we actually had to have it catered. Do you or Magali, or if Bruce is here, have any memory of that?
Yeah,
That was the original thought, but then they changed their opinion, and so we had it catered, and we also brought food last year.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah. It was great Indian food if Bruce wants to do that again, though.
He's not here today.
Okay, any other thoughts? No? Okay, so we did have a speaker lined up for tonight. Crispin Given, who is out of Purdue, was going to come and talk to us tonight. He's a great speaker. I was really looking forward to hearing him. And so I sent my confirmation out. Hey, looking forward to hearing from you. And he says, oh, my dad has pneumonia. I'm not going anywhere. I can't do the presentation. So last minute, our speaker bailed. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump in. I have to do a presentation for Skagit Valley anyway on winterizing, and I've had one in the past, and so I just kind of updated it today. And it's going to overlap with Tracy a little bit, which is nice. Oh, she's not here. She doesn't get to call me out when she thinks I'm wrong. So Tracy, you're going to find that I've got some things in there that Tracy didn't have. She had some things I don't have. On about 95 or more % of the stuff, we we agree completely and do it exactly the same way. And then there are some things that we do differently. And I think it's really good for you to hear different ways of doing things, because there are some parts of beekeeping that is a science, just non-negotiable. You have to manage your mites, right? That's the number one scientific rule of beekeeping. But other things are kind of the art of beekeeping. And that's why you get so many opinions, because art has a lot of variations. So I'm going to jump in and do a presentation similar to what Tracy did, but different. Normally I would feel bad that you're seeing kind of the same thing twice, but I know when you're beginning, repetition is really important and really good. So I kind of never hesitate to, as I get older, this is a great hobby for me because I repeat myself all the time. Not so bad yet, but so I'm going to jump into this presentation. So remember, I did just fix it up tonight. I might have a few clunky spots, and this is my first time through it in a year or so. And then it may not take the full hour. So if we have a few more questions at the end, then we'll take time for that, but it might be a little bit shorter today. So let me do first, remember the order I have to do this in. Screen share. Oops, I have to start the thing first. So starting it. Uh-oh. Bear with me. Share. Oh, that's the wrong one. Oh, can you see a blue? Do you see a beginning beekeeping, or do you see a blue polar bear? Blue with polar bear? Ah, yes. Okay, good. And is it full screen or is it preview, Magali? Not full screen? Okay.
It's you haven't started presentation mode on our end.
Okay, let's try that. Okay, there we go. Now is it full screen?
Nope, no, we've lost you completely. We just see your face.
Oh, because the external display is disconnected. Okay, we're going to do it in preview mode. Zoom gave me some message about screen sharing stopped because it disconnected display. So anyway, let me drat. Then it kicked me out of screen share. So let's try again. There we go. Blue polar bear. All right, we are tracking. So, and you'll get to see the preview thing, but I can't help that. So we're just going to talk really briefly, touching on some of the same things that Tracy did on how to get your bees ready for winter. There we go. And did the picture advance, Magali? Okay. All the things that can go wrong, checking. So first we're going to talk a little bit about how to prepare your colony. And then we're going to talk about how to prepare your hive, because there's two different things. There's the bees and the box. And so we're going to kind of address them separately. But first we need to understand what our bees do in the winter. And in the winter, the way we generally have our setup started is they start out in that bottom box. Generally your brood is in the bottom box and the honey is up in the top box. And as winter goes on, the bees form a cluster, kind of a basketball shaped cluster, and they slowly eat their way through the honey up to the top of the box. And you can see here at different rates, they're going to the top of the box. One of them is still fairly low in the box, and a couple of them are all the way up at the top already. Part of it depends on what their food stores are. Part of it depends on where the heat is. They like to hang out, trying to stay warm at the top of the box. But the bees start in the bottom and slowly work their way up. The way they move within the hive is this is what a cluster looks like. So within the cluster, there's what's called a mantle of bees. And these are kind of insulator bees. They go into this kind of cold torpor. They lock their legs together and they create a heat shield of insulation that helps to hold the heat inside of the cluster. And then there's other bees that walk around between the frames and they fan and they circulate that heat within the cluster so that the heat is moving and they're always ventilating. And then there's a third bee called a heat generating bee. And this picture doesn't really quite capture it because what happens is those heat generating bees go head first into the cells and they vibrate and they generate heat by vibrating. So you've got bees head first in the cells generating heat. And then you've got other bees walking around on the frames, fanning that heat around. And then you've got the insulating mantle of bees that helps keep it warm. And the colder it is, the tighter that cluster is because that mantle has to tighten up really well to keep that heat in. And on warmer days, it expands. So some days the cluster is big and some days the cluster is smaller. In the spring, that makes it a little hard to tell how your bees are actually doing because the cluster size varies day to day depending on the spring weather. But that also allows them to move easily through the colony. Sometimes if it gets really, really cold and they eat all of their honey and they're in a tight cluster and can't move, sometimes they can starve or run out of food. But normally what we do is we get a warm day and that cluster expands and the bees move with that expansion and then the cluster moves to where that food is. So they can actually move and with the expansion and the contraction through the hive. And the way they actually physiologically generate the heat is they've got two sets of muscles in their thorax. And the thorax is where the wings are attached. And these vertical muscles here, when those contract, that's what helps their wings to flap. About every one contraction generates about 3 wing flaps. So they kind of start it and it goes and goes and they start it again. So it's not a single contraction to a single wing flap. It's how they're able to flap so fast. They also have a set of horizontal muscles going through their thorax. And when they contract and relax those, they can vibrate and generate heat without actually beating up their wings on the inside of the colony. So it's a similar motion to flying, except it's a different set of muscles. So that's how they actually generate the heat. So let's take a quick look at our prep list for winter bees. And this is for the colony of bees itself. First, we're going to take a look at mites and how you have to keep that mite count low. Then we're going to look at strong colonies. What makes a strong colony? How do you get there? Then we're going to look at food stores that the bees have already collected. And then we're going to move on to winterizing the hive itself. So in order to understand bees in winter, we have to understand a fat body, because the fat body, a healthy fat body, is what makes a winter bee and what allows them to live all the way till spring. They're a bridge generation that goes from winter all the way through fall, all the way through to spring. And most bees, when they're nurse bees, so the fat body is where they process pollen. The nurse bees eat pollen and they use an organ called the fat body to digest that and turn it into brood food. As the bees get older and older, their fat body gets smaller and smaller, and they're less able to make any brood food protein on their own. And the foragers actually rely on the nurse bees to feed them. They don't make enough vitellogenin, the fat bodies, in their own fat bodies to even feed themselves. So they rely on the nurse bees. So fat bodies are super important. Now, what Sammy Ramsey helped us learn about, it's not quite 10 years ago yet, but getting there, is we used to think that mites fed on the blood or the hemolymph of the bee, but in actuality, he found that the mites feed mostly on that fat body. It's a really nutritious soup, and it helps the mites. The mites use that to reproduce. They literally cannot reproduce unless they are eating the fat body of the bees. And so the damage that the mites do is irreversible. You can't feed the colony or try and take extra good care of them to reverse the effects of mite infestation. And so what happens is what makes a difference, let's see, a winter bee lives that full 6 to 9 months. In fact, they found that bees with healthy fat bodies in laboratory conditions can actually live up to 2 years for a worker bee. Not out in the wild, of course, but in labs they can. So those winter bees can really live quite a long time. But once bees have started doing nursing duties and feeding out their vitellogenin, their life shortens up. Or if they've been damaged by varroa mites, it literally shortens their lives. So a bee with a damaged fat body is going to live 3 to 8 weeks. And instead of the 6 months that we need them to live during summer. And so what happens is we find that as those damaged bees die off, the cluster gets smaller and smaller. And there's this dwindling effect. And they no longer have enough bees to generate warmth. Remember, you need all those heater bees, and you need a certain size cluster to even generate enough heat to keep the colony alive. And the effect of the varroa causes a dwindling of that population. The colony contracts and gets smaller and can no longer keep itself warm. And what you find in the spring when you open it up, or in the middle of winter, is you'll find a small cluster of dead, moldy bees with not as many bees on the bottom board as you'd think. And the reason for that is because bees are very altruistic, and when they're sick or dying, they take themselves out of the hive and they leave, so no one else has to clean them up, and they don't infect anyone. You can tell a starvation because a starvation, they're all healthy and they're fine, so nobody leaves the hive, and then whoop, they all starve at once, and you get like an inch or two of dead bees on the bottom. So if you don't see an inch or two of dead bees down there, your bees probably didn't starve to death. They probably died either from the effects of varroa, either from reduced fat bodies or from the viruses that varroa bring. So number one rule of beekeeping, and these are in order that I feel that they're most important. I feel that mite control is the single most important thing that you need to learn in beekeeping. 80% of colony losses are due to the effects of varroa. Before varroa came around in the 1980s, the average beekeeper lost maybe 1 in 10 hives every year. And now, especially with beginner beekeepers, the rate is sometimes 50% and up. Even the pros have a higher than 30% loss, and they're doing everything they can to control the mites. So it's the number one thing you need to learn to do. Number two is for winter, is we need to have strong colonies. And Tracy definitely talked about this. Ideally, I like to say 20 frames, nirvana is 20 frames covered in bees. If you're there, then you're golden, you have enough bees. Can you overwinter with fewer? Yeah, it's possible. But if you've got really weak hives, like, under 10 frames of bees in a hive, you really do need to combine those in. And you want to make sure to combine a weak hive with a strong hive, assuming it's not sick, like we were talking about earlier. That was a great lead up. That was way more in depth than what I can do here. So that was a great conversation. But if you take and combine 2 weak colonies, you're just going to wind up with another weak colony. So everything in the hive is driven by the queen. And most often, if the colony is weak, it's because something with the queen, either she's not good at fighting off varroa or viruses, or she just doesn't produce a lot of brood. So if you take 2 weak queens and combine them together, then they'll be stronger for a few minutes, a few weeks, and then they'll kind of dwindle down and you'll wind up with a colony the same size. So do take those weaker bees, combine them into your stronger bees, help boost that strong queen and help her get through the winter, and your bees will be better off. If you have really small colonies, you can overwinter them in nukes, a double deep nuke. If you've happen to have 2 nuke boxes, you can put 5 frames of bees in the bottom and 5 frames of honey on top. And if you keep them warm and insulate them, some people are very good at overwintering nukes. It is a little iffier than a full-size hive. And then food stores. So there's always the rule of thumb that says 60 to 90 pounds of honey in a hive. And I just always scratch my head. Then I have to start doing math, right? There's so many pounds on a frame and how many frames. So my rule, and it's a different size hive. What if it's an 8 or a shallow? So my rule of thumb is always that 50% of the hive should be capped food. So if you are overwintering a nuke, you've got 5 frames of bees and 5 frames of honey. If you've got 10 frame deeps, then I'm going to have whatever bees I have brood on the bottom, but I'm going to make sure that I have at least 10 frames of capped resources in there. And again, if you're a little bit short, that happens. You can supplement with sugar, but the sugar doesn't have as high a nutrition level, and they found that although the bees survive fine on the sugar over winter, they don't survive as well. All of their biometric markers are lower when all they're eating is sugar. So think of sugar as like a supplement. They need the nutrition, the enzymes that they get in the actual honey. Or what I'm not sure about is if capped sugar water, I'm sure it doesn't have the minerals and stuff in it that nectar has, but it might have some of the enzymes that the bees add. So there might be a little bit more nutrition in capped sugar water than dry sugar. I don't know about that. So then let's talk about now the hive, getting your hive ready for winter. And I actually just added this while Tracy was talking, because I heard, oh yeah, that slide, that's a great slide. So you saw this on her presentation. Think of honey as edible insulation. And what you do is you kind of take the honey and you use it to make a tree out of your hive. So I like to try and put a couple frames of honey on either side, and that helps to insulate them. It has a really high R value. And then you want this whole top box in honey also. Now, remember when you're tucking them in for the night and arranging them like this, by the time they get to winter, by the time they get to spring, all of your bees are going to be up in the top of the box. So when you arrange your bees for winter, you want to think about where they're going to wind up in spring. So I always try and have a frame of pollen up here in this top box, because that's where they're going to be raising their brood in the spring, and they really need that pollen to feed the babies. So I do try and make sure there's a frame of pollen near the middle top. And then if you wind up short on frames, so we don't always get this ideal 50% of the hive filled with honey. Sometimes maybe we had a feeder in there that was taking up 2 frames. And so we go to pull that feeder out in winter and we've got a blank spot. Or maybe there's some where the bees haven't fully drawn the wax on it even yet. Yet it's like 25% honey and the rest of it's not even drawn yet. They have a hard time doing anything with foundation, undrawn foundation in the winter. It's just, it's like a cold water bed. All it does is suck the heat out of the hive. It's just not anything that they can use. They can't go head first into it and generate heat. There's no wax on it that helps hold the heat. So I try and get anything out of the hive that's not fully drawn, and I'll just leave a frame out. If it's got a little bit of honey on it, I leave it out so they can rob it, and they'll just take that honey and bring it right back into the hive, so it doesn't go to waste. But anything that is either completely undrawn or even drawn but completely empty, I replace with follower boards, which Tracy mentioned. And what that is it's a big chunk of, I use that pink styrofoam, the high density Pink Panther pink styrofoam, and I cut a chunk bigger than a frame, because remember the frames, there's gaps on the top and bottom of the frame. So I just cut it kind of big enough to fill that space. And I think if, let's say if I had 4 frames that weren't filled on this hive, I would actually put them on the 2 outside ones. And that would make it more like a tree. If I have an odd number, I'm going to still try and keep that honey on the top, and I'm going to put the insulation on the bottom, because the bees are going to wind up at the top, and I want them to be closer to the food. And the honey absorbs that heat. It's a heat sink. It holds it and works great for insulation. So let's, so that's how you configure the inside of the box for the bees. Now, yeah, I'll move on. So let's talk about from the bottom up, how you want to arrange your hive from the bottom up so that the bees are set for winter. So first, like Tracy said, you want to make sure that your screen bottom boards are closed. We don't want to have any wind coming and swirling up in there and pulling their heat out. So the very bottom thing is the bottom board, close that up. Next up is the entrance. You want to reduce it and put mouse guards on. You can either buy mouse guards, or you can just use 1/4-inch screen and just staple it on there. So, some things in beekeeping, you don't actually have to buy things for, because there's already so many already. So in a pinch, just staple on your screen. Now, I do close off all of my upper entrances. This is the 2nd year that I've done it, and I'm going to go over a little bit later why I do. It's a whole different philosophy, and I'll talk about kind of where I'm coming from in doing that. But you do want to, I just put duct tape over my upper entrances. And what I find is I like duct tape, because if the bees want an upper entrance, it's really easy for them to chew through. In fact, it's easier for them to chew through duct tape and reopen their entrance than it is for them to fill an entrance with propolis. It takes a lot of work for them to collect and stick all that propolis there, and especially this time of year, it's just not very available. So it to me, it feels like it actually gives them the option. I have about maybe 1 out of 5 or 25% of the hives will chew through the duct tape and decide, but it's a little hole. It's like just a bee-sized hole, and decide that they want that entrance there. I actually did have one that chewed through the upper insulation last year and made themselves an entrance on the back. So I don't know what they were doing, but but they're very good at making their own entrances. What I'm trying to do is give them the option to keep that heat in and stay warm. So we'll talk briefly a little bit more about the philosophy. It's called a ventilating hive versus a condensing hive. So we'll just briefly touch on that at the end. So we did our bottom boards, screen bottom boards are in, mouse guard is on. I tape off my upper entrances. So then we've got our brood boxes. And on top of the brood box, you need some kind of feeding shim. And we'll look at some variations on feeding shims on the next slide when we talk about feeding bees in winter. So right next to the bees, you want to have a feeding shim. This looks like an inner cover. This is actually what I use for my feeding shim. But there's different types. But the food goes right next to the bees. I remember my first couple of years, it was really kind of confusing. I had to keep looking up what order does everything go in? So it goes bees and then food next. So they can have it right there, put them right next to the fridge. And then next is moisture control. I use these particle board. It's medium density particle board. It's also called Homo Soap board from Home Depot, or you can buy them on Man Lake. This is a picture of Man Lakes. I really like them. I think they are fantastic for pulling moisture out. They last for years and years. There's 0 effort. I just pull them out of storage and put them on the hive. I don't have to mess with chips or anything. And they store at a very small spot. So I have a lot of hives, and storage can be an issue. So these are really handy. And then, like Tracy said, underneath the lid, you want to have this pink panther insulation. So this is a 2-inch sheet, which gives you an R10, which is really pretty good. I think I'd have to look and remember. I think a natural tree is around, I want to say R15 or 20. And so this pink panther is an R10. So it's about the highest insulation for something portable that we can get on them. And I do wrap and insulate my hives, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, which Tracy doesn't. So it's kind of nice. You get different opinions here. I'm not saying that my way is right. It's how I like to do it. I've had success that way, and I know she's had success the way she does it. So there's really not a right way. Do what works for you. So let's talk a little bit about ways to feed in the winter. So I always put supplementary sugar on my hives, even if they have a full, 50% of the hives or more with honey. I still put the sugar up there. I find they eat it. They like it. It gets them a little further into spring without having to, I don't know. If they're up there eating it, I'm feeding it to them, and they seem to do just fine on it. The way I feed in the winter is I use a deep inner cover. This has got a circle hole in it that fits a jar feeder. And I just pour dry sugar in here. And I'll come back and peek, and if they've eaten most of it, then I just pour more dry sugar in. It's just really, really easy. And I throw a pollen patty in there also. I know Tracy said no pollen patties in the winter. I do think pollen patties in the winter are okay. And the reason for that is I believe that there are multiple factors that causes the queen to brood up. There are day length sensitive, the response to natural forage out there, and time of year temperature sensitive. And I think that a pollen patty, which is 85% brewer's yeast, isn't going to be enough to trigger the queen to do this massive brood up unless she's already kind of inclined to. The Italians, maybe. If you've got Italians, they will brood up at the drop of a hat. But most of our bees here in the Northwest are carniolan types, and I think it takes more than a pollen patty to get them to brood up. Now, mountain camp is a great way. Tracy also described this. You just throw a newspaper down on top of the frames, you pour some dry sugar on there, and it works great. The bees love it. You do need to remember when you go to refill this, you need to put a fresh sheet of newspaper on there. So you kind of wind up with this newspaper sugar sandwich, because when you go to pour more sugar on, if all of these holes are here, that sugar is just going to flow straight through the bottom board. So they will be able to chew through the layers of newspaper and get into the sugar in the sandwich. So don't be afraid to just put more paper on there and more sugar. And then the last most common type is a candy board. And Tracy had a picture of this. There's a screen on the bottom of it. And the bees can come up through the screen. And this is hard candy. So it's been wetted down with a little bit of water. And in this case, there's a pollen patty in the middle. And then there's this block. They're going to take the block out, and that just leaves a hole in it during the winter. So the bees can actually come up to the top of the pollen patty, up to the top of the candy board and walk around on it, which they tend to do. The other nice thing about sugar on top, any of these three forms, is sugar is hygroscopic. It pulls moisture out of the hive. So in addition to your quilt box or your homosote board, the sugar helps pull some of the moisture out of the hive. So it's a good, and the moisture that it pulls in, then the bees then can use that to kind of lick the syrup and eat it. So it's a real good way to feed them in the winter. So how often do you check the sugar? I like to check once a month. I just go out there and I peek under the lid. Starting in October, after the temperatures drop. If I check them once a month. If they're low on sugar, if they've eaten, say, half of it, then I go on, I fill it up again. And then once you get to February, 1st of March, this is February till spring. Sorry, this should be March. Once I get to March, then I start checking every other week, because that's when they're brooding up. And they can go through the sugar really fast, especially the Italians. They brood up so fast they can really burn through a lot of sugar. And suddenly you go out there in April or May and your bees starved and you have no idea. So twice a month in early spring, but once a month in the winter is fine. So I'm going to talk just a little bit now about wrapping hives and why I wrap hives. I know it's always one thing that's controversial. You'll get different opinions on it. Bees have the lowest immunity of any animal in the animal kingdom. They do not have antibodies. They are not, for the most part, they're not born with immunity. The queen can pass on a little bit of immunity to the eggs, which is where we get those bees that can be resistant to American foul brood. But for the most part, their immunity comes from social activities. So they have what's called social immunity. And that's where they groom each other and they clean pathogens off the outside of each other. And it's also through trophallaxis. When they feed each other, the nurse bees will get bits of broken virus. They'll break down the virus in their body, and then they feed that to each other. They basically inoculating each other, and that's how that the American foul brood vaccine works. Is they give it to the queen by feeding her through other bees. So social immunity is really important for bees, and the more they can walk around and have space within the colony to work and do things like that, and not just spend all their time shivering and generating heat, I feel like they have a better chance to come out of winter healthier with less effect from the viruses. It also makes it so they have to spend less energy on heating and more energy on other activities. So I do like to wrap the outside of my hives. It helps them to retain the heat. And then I also cover the top of my hives with that insulation that Tracy talked about inside of the lid. And then you want to make sure to have a strap or a rock to hold the lid down, because the wind will pick it up and blow it off in the winter. Let's see here. And so then briefly, I also want to talk about condensing hives. So when I came up in beekeeping, which was like, it doesn't feel like it was that long ago, it was 8 years ago. The only advice there was have an upper entrance, because the idea is you want that air to circulate through the hive so the moisture can get carried out of the hive. And now you're starting to see a lot more research on what's called a condensing hive. So bees don't die of the moisture. The reason the moisture shows up on a dead cluster is because there was not enough heat to drive away the moisture. So if you're out in the woods and it's cold and it's damp and you build a big, huge bonfire, you're going to feel how dry it is. It drives out the moisture. But as that fire goes out and that cold moisture starts coming back in, you're going to get damp. So it's the size of the cluster and the size of the heat that draws off the moisture, that throws off the moisture, rather than moisture getting in from the outside of the colony of the hive. So bees actually do really well in high humidity and high CO2 environments. They've done tests on that. Up to 85% humidity, the bees do just fine. And CO2 actually helps the bees to become more dormant and a little bit less active. It kind of helps them to slow down a little bit and just kind of not hibernate, but dormancy in the winter. So they do really well in high humidity and high CO2. What doesn't do well in those conditions is varroa mites. So it really helps to kind of discourage varroa mites over the winter. And I always just think, if I'm in my house and it's cold and it's damp and I'm trying to keep it warm, the last thing I'm going to do is throw open one of those upper windows and let all that heat out from the top, because the heat's going to go straight out the top. Your cluster is in the top of the hive, and you open that window and all that heat goes straight out. I'm going to keep the window closed and I'm going to try and generate more heat. So that's my philosophy on it. And it is a controversial subject. So kind of, do your own research and kind of figure out what works best for you. And I mean, here's my actual hives. This is from a couple years ago. So this is literally how I how I wrap my hives. There's full pink insulation all around the outside. There is a layer of pink insulation under the lid. And then this one on the top may not do as much, but it works as a drip rail. So it adds a little bit more insulation, and it also extends out past the edge and gets a drip rail on there so that the water doesn't run down the side of the hive. These bee cozies are kind of a pain in the neck, especially if you use vaporizers in the winter. As soon as they get a hole in them, they're like a wet sleeping bag. They fill up with water, and for $35 or $40, you only get a couple of years out of them. And they're kind of a pain in the neck to roll up and store. It's like wrestling this kind of spider-filled, kind of damp thing in the spring. If you're going to wrap the outside, pink foam is good. You can just cut it and stack it somewhere. The other thing I do at the clubs and at our apiary is we use the silver bubble wrap that you can get at Home Depot. And you wrap that around, 1 or 2 layers of it around a hive. And then I use black plastic, like what you get at Home Depot that comes over the lumber piles, a giant pile of plywood as it drives down the road on the semi truck. The back side of that is black and it's free. So I put on the silver bubble wrap, and then I put on this matte black plastic, and that matte plastic helps to absorb the sun, what little sun there is in the winter, but it gets a little bit of solar gain into the hive and kind of helps them a little bit. And we did that up at 15 hives with Mount Baker last year. We had 100% overwintering with the bubble wrap and the black wrap, which is really an inexpensive way to go if you're wrapping your hives. So those are just some different options, and you got to see 2 different opinions on how things are done, which is really fantastic, because really what you need to do as a beekeeper is develop your own methods and the art of how you like to keep your bees. So we didn't quite make it to 8, so we've got a few minutes if anybody's got any last minute questions or confusions.
I have a question. So I've been feeding 2-to-1 sugar syrup, and both hives have been just sucking it up. I keep making more. When should I switch to just dry sugar?
So I'm a little of an outlier on that also. So it's okay to feed 2-to-1 pretty much all fall, but you have to think of the weather. And what happens when the temperature suddenly drops is the bees can no longer evaporate the moisture out of that sugar. And then sometimes what happens is just from the heat of the bees that it's a syrup still. It's not even a honey, it's a syrup that will ferment in the comb. And that gives them dysentery. So sometimes what looks like nosema and a whole bunch of poop on the hive in the spring is actually fermented syrup that never got condensed enough. So I try to pull my 2-to-1 by September 1st. I'm going to tell you, I'm the only person I know that does this, and it works for me. But I stop feeding 2-to-1 by September 1st, and I go to dry sugar. I don't have to mix 2-to-1 syrup anymore. They take that dry sugar and they put just as much water in it as they need to liquefy it. And then they put it in the comb at just the rate that they can cure it. I feel like it gives them more control instead of me just dumping a whole bunch of wet syrup in there that they then have to kind of process, with more or less success depending on the weather. So that's how I do it. The common advice is that you should feed 2-to-1 syrup until the temperatures drop below 55. And to me, that's just a little, I don't know. I don't want to have all that wet syrup in there. It's too hard for them to keep warm. But that's just me.
Yeah.
So would that be a daytime temperature of 55 or average?
Yep.
Over
Yeah,
daytime?
the 55 rule is daytime daytime highs, not average temperature, but a daytime heat.
Okay,
So like my rule of thumb is right now, if they're taking 2 quarts a day, they're storing most of that. And so I'm pulling mine off October 1st, but mine are down to 1 quart a day, which is pretty much their consumption rate just to keep them from touching what's already in the hive.
Mhm. Yep. Honey preservation. Yes. What else, you guys? So again, like we said earlier, we're all going in. It's all a wing and a prayer. You know, we wake up in the middle of the night and it's down to, you know, below freezing, and we worry about our bees. That's normal. We've all lost bees, so do the best you can all year long. You got to keep the mites down all year long. Do the best you can to get them set and ready for winter, and then just don't be too sad if you lose a couple colonies. It happens to all of us. You just get some more bees and you try again. Peter, do you have any thoughts or advice? I saw you there, so I'll ask Peter.
No, I'm just running the mic here in case anyone wants it. And we had a weird thing on the.
Okay. But you have good advice too, so I just thought to see if you had anything.
I appreciate that. No major additions or changes to what you and Tracy already talked about.
Okay, good. Always not opinion shopping, but enjoying differing ways people. It's always interesting to hear how people keep their bees. Okay, guys, well, I'm not going to hold you any longer. Thank you so much for coming. We have a great speaker next month who hopefully will not bail on us. We've got Abigail Chapman, who's going to come and talk to us. And then after that, we've got our elections and our potluck. And then, oh my gosh, it's going to be January already. So thanks for coming tonight, and we will see you on October 22nd.
thank you.